Welcome to the podcast of Café des Artistes No.3 on Johan Grimonprez.
Now I'm really happy to introduce Neil Cox and Harry Weeks, our two presenters. Neil is the Professor of Modern and Contemporary Art at the University of Edinburgh. His interests lie at the intersection of modern artistic practices and theoretical and philosophical discourses. His long-term project focuses on surrealist conceptions of history that will draw upon theories of violence and sovereignty. Neil is also director of the Artist Rooms Research Partnership, which is art, and Harry Weeks is an independent curator and doctoral researcher and teaching fellow at the University of Edinburgh. His PhD research project, initiated in 2010, is entitled Negotiations of Community in Contemporary Art, and examines the convergences of post-communist political philosophy and contemporary art practice. He curated the Ethics, Nationalism and the Theatrics of Documentation Film Lab programme at Stills Gallery Edinburgh in 2011, and he has collaborated and he has spoken widely at conferences in the UK as well as in New York and Reykjavik on a variety of issues relating to contemporary art and politics. So we'll begin with Harry. Over to you.
Turn myself on. Hello? Is that working? Excellent. Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you to Neil and everyone else involved with the Artist Rooms Research Partnership. And thank you all for coming along to talk about the work which I have absolutely no hesitation in saying is for me one of the most significant and powerful works of contemporary art produced over the past few decades. The work in question is Dial History, which is a 16-minute long film produced by the Belgian artist Johan Grimonprez in 1997, and it is in the Artist Rooms collection. It's also available to watch online on Johan Grimonprez's website, and if you are enthused to do so after tonight, then I thoroughly recommend you do that. I'm going to talk about this work within two interrelated contexts. Firstly, I'm going to look at the convergence of contemporary art and politics in recent years, and secondly, what has been referred to as the documentary turn in contemporary art. Before getting to those two, I shall get some very boring biographical details out of the way. I don't think we really need to dwell on them too much, but he was born in Belgium in 1962, attended the Academy of Fine Arts in Ghent, the Whitney Museum Independent Study Programme in New York, and the Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht. This is his photo off his website. I think this is the troubled artist at work. So on to the first half of my talk, contemporary art and politics. If we compare the screen grab of Dial History that I had up at the beginning, if you remember that, with these two works, on the left we have Richard Long, and on the right Ian Hamilton Finn, you might be able to detect a slight change in temperature from this event compared to the previous two Café des Artistes if you were there. And I think that's a necessary change in temperature. Without making any judgment on the quality of these two artists, they are both fine artists. The particular kind of brand of bucolic, contemplative conceptualism doesn't necessarily change a particularly full portrait of the field of contemporary art now. And I think by introducing Johan Grimonprez, I'm hopefully going to paint a little extra corner of this grand scene of contemporary art. So contemporary art's engagement with the political. This is just 4 examples of biennials, these grand scale mega exhibitions that have really proliferated in the art scene over the past 20 or so years in particular. This is just an example of 4 that have explicitly engaged with the political. This is just really its evidence for me to say, look, art does engage with the political, and correct it. The Berlin Biennale of 2012, which was curated by a Polish artist called Epilogue, who his own work is very much politically engaged. The top right here we have the 2011 Istanbul Biennial, which I don't know if you can read, it's quite small letters here, explored the rich relationship between art and politics, focusing on artworks that are both formally innovative and politically outspoken. The bottom right is the 2007 8th Sharjah biennial entitled Still Life, Art, Ecology and the Politics of Change. And in the bottom left, even the granddaddy of all biennials has not been averse to a little bit of political engagement now and then, as this clip from the BBC website reporting on the 2011 biennial shows. But political engagement in contemporary art doesn't necessarily mean activism dressed as art or art dressed as activism. It takes a huge variety of forms. In the top left, we have the work by Superflex, who are a Danish collective, whose work kind of embodies what wants to become referred to as relational art practices, a term coined by the French curator Nicolas Bourriaud. In the top right, at the other end of the spectrum, we've got Grayson Perry, national treasure, OBE, using incredibly traditional practices, methods, processes, media, techniques, and yet his work is thoroughly geared towards politics. In the bottom left, we've got another British artist, Jeremy Deller, his 2001 film The Battle of Orgreave, which was a reenactment of a battle that happened during the miners' strike in 1984. And the bottom right, I.B.Tauris, whose work often isn't explicitly political in a formal way, and yet cannot be viewed without politics being taken into consideration because of his life story, which I'm sure most of you will know. But of course, this is all nothing new. Art and politics have always been intertwined. You could quite easily make the argument that every single piece of art ever created is in some way implicated with the political. But it's perhaps during the French Revolution and the period around the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, that art and politics converge a little bit more concretely. And this is David's Death of Marat from 1793 and Goya's The 3rd of May 1808 from 1814. Kind of demonstrate this, and C.J. Clarke famously said that the Death of Marat constituted the first modernist painting because of the way that it took the stuff of politics as its material and did not transmute it. The 20th century, which has been, just to survey a few recent book titles on 20th century history, has been referred to as the century of warfare, the violent century, the age of extremes. The 20th century sees a real ramping up of art political engagement, but it also sees a kind of divergence. On the one hand, you have work that deals with politics in the sense of governments, of nations, of states, of war and revolution, and Picasso's Guernica I'm using to represent this strand. But then throughout the 20th century, you get this complementary strand of what politics means, which I'm embodying in this Gorilla poster. It's kind of to quote the feminist mantra, the person is political. In the wake of second wave feminism in the 60s and identity politics during the 70s, it became an increasing realisation that politics wasn't just what happened at this governmental state level. In fact, our everyday existence is entirely impacted by politics and is politics. The history and politics of the 20th century is something that has recurred throughout Johan Grimonprez's work. This is a film from 2009 entitled Double Take, which looks at the history of the Cold War. But it does so through quite an unorthodox method. He tells the story of the Cold War through the life or a fictionalized account of a moment in the life of Alfred Hitchcock. He tells this story of Alfred Hitchcock meeting his double on the set of The Birds in 1962. In order to tell, as a kind of allegory for the fear of the other, and through this idea of the double, the fear of the self, that emerged during the Cold War and really characterised kind of media representations of the Cold War. The film uses, as you can see on this slide and the slide before, found footage, interviews, news clips, clips from films, clips from Alfred Hitchcock's TV show, as well as a few bits which I haven't included in these slides, of footage recorded by Grimonprez of a professional Hitchcock impersonator. And this kind of tying together of all these bits of found footage really characterises Grimonprez's work throughout his career. It's been referred to as a media archaeology practice, which I think is quite an apt way of describing it. And it's this media archaeology practice that really emerged in dial history, which was one of his earlier works from 1997. Dial history likewise deals with 20th century politics and history. In this case, through a narrative that he draws of the history of plane hijackings, from the first recorded hijack in Peru in 1931, through to 1970, the first televised hijack, which happened in Japan, all the way through to hijackings that occurred during the late 80s and 90s, notably Lockerbie, which we all know about. Again, it uses news reports, interviews, bits of found footage stitched together in quite an unusual way. It's soundtracked by very sparse and quite abstract narration, a lot of it taken from, a lot of it comprised of quotations from various literary sources, particularly the writing of Don DeLillo. And some very odd choices of music as well, which you'll hear a bit later. This idea of media archaeology practice and the use of found footage leads me on to the second of the two contexts that I want to look at this work in. And that is the documentary term. Specifically, I want to look at this form, the video essay, which emerged as art increasingly borrowed from the field of documentary. The documentary term has tended to use lens-based media, but it does again take a variety of forms. In the top left we have Boris Mikhailov's kind of ethnographic photography. The top right is still from a film by Renzo Martins, which is a sort of very cynical, self-reflexive look at aid and journalism in Africa. The bottom right is Alan Sekula's The Forgotten Space, and the bottom left again is the Battle of Aldridge, which kind of spans the two things I'm talking about quite nicely. Our very own Angela Dimitrokhi, sitting over there, sorry to think that, noted in a piece of writing on Ursula Beeman, another artist, an artist who kind of exemplifies the video essay form, that the convergence of art and documentation is one of the tendencies which most defines the terrain of contemporary art. But the documentary term, as I suggested before, doesn't necessarily entail an entire absorption of the documentary into art. Rather, what has happened is a very strategic and selective use of elements of the documentary in a contemporary art context. Elements including a documentary aesthetic, the processes and techniques of documentary, and importantly, the kind of air of sincerity and objectivity that the documentary is supposed to be in possession of. This is a still from Ursula Beeman's Writing Desire from 2000, a film which examines the impact of the internet on the flow of women's bodies through things like trafficking, mail order brides and so on. Again, it uses this stitching together of found footage in a kind of unorthodox way, a way that you potentially wouldn't necessarily get away with if you were calling it strict documentary with a capital D. There's another example of a video essay from much more recently, and one that deals with very similar subject matter to dial history. Peter Stiles in Freefall from 2010, which looks at globalization and the financial crisis through the story of one particular aircraft, which now resides in an airplane graveyard in the Mojave Desert, where planes go to die. And it traces the history of this one plane throughout the late 20th century as a means of telling all of these different stories about the processes of economic globalization. But one of the things that really characterizes this video essay form is a kind of humour and playfulness with the material. And in the bottom right here, we see Hito Shire on the left and an actor who appears throughout the film on the right, performing a dance routine that ends the film, in which they mimic pre-flight airplane safety demonstrations. This kind of playfulness extends into dial history as well. You have these, as I said earlier, the kind of strange soundtrack, but also you have interspersed with the most shocking images of violence and horror with cartoon footage and this motif that recurs throughout of a ringing telephone. And I think this sort of juxtaposition of strange elements allows Grimonprez to tell a different story than you would be able to using a strict documentary technique, a strict documentary process. And Alvin Liu, writing a book that was published recently about Johan Grimonprez, says the work's shadow is cast much further and wider in the singular history of plane hijackings. And the story that I think Grimonprez tells is to do with the media's relationship to plane hijackings, which are the most overt subject matter in the film. And I think these images kind of display this. Again, in this same book that was published a couple of years ago, it's titled It's a Poor Sort of Memory That Only Works Backwards. It's a very good book. It describes the collusion between the media and terrorism. This idea that the media adores terrorism. It adores the spectacle. And yeah, I mean, this slide in the bottom left-hand corner, the idea that this was the first in 1970, the first televised hijack, and that, according to Grimonprez anyway, Tokyo streets were deserted because millions were glued to this. And then the top two images here, we have an Italian hijacker, Raffaele Michele. And in the top left, you see a stream of journalists running up the street to try and get to him. And here they are kind of surrounding him. So there's this real interest on Grimonprez's part in the relationship between the media and terrorism, and then by extension, our relationship to terrorism. The media is how we receive these images. There's a bit of narration at the beginning. I can't quite remember where this comes from, but it says, everything around us tends to channel our lives towards some final reality in print on film. Everything seeks its own heightened version. Nothing happens until it's consumed. And Alvin Liu, who I quoted before, says that what Grimonprez is trying to do here is to take the mind control of the media and spin it back to them, which I think is quite a nice way of putting it. So we're going to watch about 10 minutes of it, of that history. And there's two things that I just want to sort of flag out for you to keep in mind while watching it. The first is this idea of the spectacle and the media representation of these images of violence and catastrophe. This is a still from the beginning of the film where we see a plane crashing towards the camera. And the whole screen is sort of gradually engulfed in flame as it comes closer and closer. And it's a real demonstration of this spectacle. And the second I've not really talked about in this, but Neil will fill in that gap. And in another nod to Neil, who is a great expert on Picasso, this is a slide which depicts Guernica. after it was moved from MoMA, where it had resided for most of the 40s until 1981, into the, so read this because I always forget the name of it. Does anyone know?
The Buen Retiro.
Yeah. Casa del Buen Retiro, there you go, yes. And of course it couldn't have been shown in Spain prior to this point because of Franco's regime, which was in place until 75, I think. And of course the painting itself is incredibly critical of the Spanish nationalist side during the Spanish Civil War. So what I want to flag up with this is the question of the politics of exhibition of politically engaged art. Introducing politics into art raises a whole extra load of considerations that need to be taken into account when displaying these works. How they're displayed, where they're displayed, when they're displayed. And on that note,
so I'm not going to speak very long, because I'm just going to talk about Grimonprez and me, and what actually, in the 18th century, would have accurately been called a moral dilemma, to do this film dial history, which is the only work by Grimonprez in the Artist Rooms collection. My connection to it relates to the fact that I was trustee, eventually chair of board of trustees of a thing called First Sight, a contemporary visual arts organisation in Colchester, in North Essex. This is the building that First Sight now operates in, which is designed by Raphael Vignoli, opened in 2009, and took a great deal of my love. But the moment when I had my moral dilemma with Grimonprez was in my early days as a trustee, when we operated, when First Sight operated out of this building, or two buildings, two 18th century townhouses knocked together on the High Street in Colchester. Very interesting spaces to show contemporary art, because you can see timber frame buildings and you can get these amazing juxtapositions, productive juxtapositions of certain kinds of objects. This is the knitwear artist, Freddie Robbins, this was in 2002. But the specific exhibition in which my moral dilemma occurred was this one, Trauma, an exhibition curated by Fiona Bradley, who now runs the Fruit Market, director of the Fruit Market, Katrina Brown, Andrew Nairn, now of Kettle's Yard in Cambridge. It was a national touring exhibition curated by Hayward at the time. And it toured, it started off in DC8 under contemporary arts, then came to First Sight, and then to Modern Art, Oxford. The show was, quite diverse in the work it showed, just by arts like Martin Boyce, three-dimensional objects, photographic, documentary works. These were the artists that featured in the show, apart from Denisa, as I showed you at the beginning, and of course Johan Grimonprez, who was represented by Dial History, a film that I knew nothing about and had never seen. The important aspect of the moral dilemma here is the date. So the show was due to open at First Sight on the 15th of September 2001. On the 11th of September 2001, I was in St Andrews, coming back from the shops, and my partner said, "You'll never believe it, but a plane's gone into the Twin Towers in New York." And probably like everyone in this room, we watched television for a long time, where this live terrorist spectacle of the climate Harry was talking about earlier unfolded, in that 24-hour TV way of people trying to interpret what was happening, and cameras being absolutely trained on the spectacle, which we all know about, and some 3,000 lives lost, including those other hijacked planes, the 4 planes, and all 2 of which crashed into the building, with these catastrophic results. And there was all that amateur footage that began to feed into it, and of course amazing documentary photographs like this one. We'll all recall as well the sort of cross-editing to the political response to those events. George Bush hearing about it when he was on a visit to a primary school. There was actually debate about that afterwards as to when he heard about it. Giving an address later that day to the nation, using that phrase for the first time, the war against terrorism. By the 20th September, that became the war on terror. And pretty rapidly after that, we had that sequence of invasions that, in a way, expressed the idea of the war on terror. The important thing to remember about that moment, I suppose, was both the sort of self-conscious discourse of historic change of orientation somehow of the Western powers, a sense of emergency, a state of emergency being initiated, and the intense kind of stories of heroism, of human achievement in adversity and so on that developed around it as well, particularly because of the New York Fire Department, for example. There are, if you want to see some of these incredible photographs, there's a book by photographer John Meyerowitz called Aftermath. He had privileged access to the stuff and took all these remarkable photographs of the things that were demolished and the process of wanting to reconstruct it. Okay, so what was my dilemma? I came back down to Colchester, I guess on about the 13th of September, and I got a phone call from the director of First Sight, Kath Wood, saying, "You've got to come in. You've got to come in and help me with something. We've got a really serious problem." So the show tour was about to open, and again, it's just worth for it to reiterate again the sense of intense seriousness that surrounded these events, and that sort of breathless moral urgency. I was called in and said, "I'm worried about the whole show, I'm particularly worried about this film. I'm particularly worried about showing this film right now." One context for that, which is important to stress, is that Colchester is a military garrison town. And so, immediately with that discourse of the war on terror, the idea of military mobilisation and so on, again, there was great charge around the idea of where the limits or lines might be in terms of what's presentable and not presentable in that context at that moment. So, the question I was being asked, and I watched this film for the first time in this context, was, Neil, should we show this film or not? We have to open the exhibition, but I'm thinking we should withdraw the film. The question I'm asking you now, which is the question we want to discuss for a bit, is if you've been in my situation, would you have shown it? Yes or no? I have that time.
Thanks guys for those presentations. So yeah, as we say, we have this dilemma for you. What would you have done in your situation? Would you have shown our history, or would you have pulled it from the exhibition? And that's what we want you to think about, along with perhaps related wider issues of censorship, self-censorship, and the role the media has played in issues of terrorism. Okay, I think that was a not too difficult decision to take all your votes. What we're going to do now is just go around, hope you've all nominated a spokesperson, and we're going to go around the tables. We're going to go around the tables and announce the table vote, and you might also want to say maybe how many for, how many against, or whether it was a hard decision or perhaps some of your considerations in the decision. So if you've got the mic, you start on this table. Who's the spokesperson here? Okay, so what's your verdict, first of all?
We said yes to each other. We did sort of take into consideration that it would be a difficult time and people might not necessarily understand, but if you used the right interpretation, you had good manipulations in the gallery to explain, and also maybe a disclaimer saying you might not be able to handle this. But I think
or just going saying when it's put together, like
yeah.
before September 11th.
But there's a certain kind of like empowerment in showing it, because Anna said the difference between like September 11th and bombings and sort of decades of terrorism with stuff previously, like the IRA and stuff, was that it was completely out of the blue and no one saw it coming, and it kind of took over people's lives, and it changed how people lived their lives. So to show that would be like a little protest against terrorism in a way. And the other thing is that it would be incredibly important to the discourse coming up. It's all about media portrayals of terrorism and how we talk about it and think about it. I think there's the entire film is really kind of like about in many different ways. And if that's going to contribute to the oncoming discourse, it's going to be around the media. And I know we're saying the benefit of hindsight, especially in the build-up to like the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's the way that we're being manipulated by the media, particularly. It would have been kind of admirable to have this sort of there to pull back on and think, how are we thinking about this? And that's why we said yes.
Okay, great, that's really good discussion on that, Josh. So if we go on to the next table, this table over here, have we got a spokesperson?
It's also yes.
Also yes, okay.
First up, yes. No votes yes. So what we're saying is, even if we didn't have it film, we would try to just hold to us and show us. So the reason that the bibliography of actually have some information that outlines the narrative and presents the film as offering historical narrative which could actually impact understanding of trauma, which is a global whatever side comes from, so that we help people interpret certain events in a more complex way.
Okay, great. On to this back table over there. Have we got? Oh, sorry.
Angela mentioned that it was her own point, it's really good, which was that she pointed out that this film became very, very famous after the events of 9/11, and many people saw it as kind of prefiguring, spooky media ontology kind of prefiguring of the event, and the opportunity that the work offers to explore that possibility and to think about the way in which the event itself has been prefigured or prepared for by so many other disasters makes it kind of seem even more compelling to want to show the film and open up the kind of historical problems that it does.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, so on to the back table.
We voted yes as well. We have 8 yes and 1 no. So,
right, so we're very much in the yes so far.
And we're kind of following on what the Untitled said, that it would be important to put the film in context and have this table to deal or some kind of warning as to what it was. But I think you can do that anyway, whatever political climate was. And we talked about the fact that the film somehow deconstructs the way you look at immediate portrayal of disaster, and so it would make you more aware of the way in which the terrorists comes up and sensationalised by media. So in some ways it undercuts that media representation and helps you to sort of understand their response towards that rather than just something like that without thinking about it. Summarise what we said.
Any more thoughts on that one from your table? Okay.
So our table also voted yes. notion of like a self-torture, but it's important that it does show Luke and the learning about the possible upsetting leadership. We also discussed that perhaps it makes it more poignant, the fact that it's within that context, and puts looking at how a lot of the news makes a subject out of tragedy, and actually asking what's going on about should be shown.
Okay, good. So if we come onto this front table now, do you want to pass the mic along?
You said yes as well.
I'm sensing a theme here.
Just because of the political content of the film, it kind of would be undermined if you didn't show it in that context. And then also it's going to events that are unveiling themselves to everyone. Yeah, but there's a good idea to say that this film and somehow make everyone see it in a different light. So I'm pretending that's what's known.
Are you all for on a yes or?
We're being too idealistic when we're saying that this film can somehow reveal it to everyone. But then,
Yeah, well, what's a different opinion?
yeah, so we're understanding this is what we
had one. Can you pass the microphone? We had one no, two yeses.
Okay, so yes, overruled.
Yes, so now we're both going towards no.
Unless you have any more thoughts on that, we'll pass to the table behind you.
If you've got 400 yeses there, and your answer is no, you have to be just like what we're doing. We all said yes. Well, we all said yes. Rather than yes.
Okay.
I think it's probably the answer. We're interested to know whether you spoke to the artist, actually, and what his particular take was, but maybe we should talk about that for later.
Yeah, Neil, will that be more of a question for a minute?
I guess it would.
Okay. Right, final table, even though that won't change the verdict.
Significant, it's like the Eurovision, you go all the way to the end. We were a very tight 3 to yes.
Oh. Right. So what were the rationales?
All of us on both sides had a lot of reservations, and mostly the huge amount of hindsight. It's very hard to make any kind of call now, sitting here in the last point. We also asked about whether or not you should speak to the artist, but that was significant. Talked a lot about what the reasoning is for pulling it, and whether it's the scale or the location, and where you draw the line on these decisions, and how you set precedent on control. We talked a lot about the difficulty. We're answering this sort of as an individual, but obviously these decisions are usually made by committee and various stakeholders, and one brave person saying what should work usually gets shouted down on city council and it's pulled. We also just briefly spoke there about the fact that it was a touring show, and it had been in one venue before this, and then it was in Colchester for a few months, and it was going to another venue after that, so I thought that might be kind of significant. If you pull this, does it never go into Colchester? Does it not go on to the venue after that? Where do you draw the line of when this work can be shown?
Yeah, well, those are all really good.
I also like the idea of projecting some news in the gallery as well to accompany your the live rolling coverage of September 2021.
Right, well, so that seems like we have a not quite unanimous yes vote, but obviously it seems like everyone had reservations on the yes, and maybe I think the context needed more information on the context perhaps. So we'll find out now what Neil actually did.
Sure, and so there was a specific question about whether we spoke to the artist. I cannot remember, is the truth. If the artist was spoken to, it would not have been by me. It would have been Kath, the director, who would have spoken to the artist. But my guess is no. And this was a kind of very short window pressure decision. And you're right in Adonian. Adonian, by the way, is a part of the Artists' Rooms team in National Galleries of Scotland and Tate. Anyway, he's right that you know, the context was tremendously significant. And he's wrong to say it was taken by a committee. It really was genuinely a decision that the director wanted me to make with her, because we were talking about a very small organisation, you know. I think at that point there were maybe 11 trustees, most of whom would not have been able to engage with that situation, if I can put it that way. And so, I mean, it was actually, you know, she was concerned about that. She was just genuinely concerned about it when all this stuff grew up, and she wanted somebody to be an interlocutor and a co-decision maker. So it's kind of weird, you know, you're obviously debating it on a table, and many of those debates were debates that we played out. But it is weird when you have got to make that decision in, as I say, a kind of situation it's hard to record the intensity of that moment. Okay, so what we do is a classic liberal compromise, is what we did. So what we did was to say that we would not show the film for, I think it was 5 days, as a mark of respect, yeah, to those who had died in this incident. The other thing we did was to phone the MP straight away. Interestingly, think about stakeholders. Again, this is a very small organisation. Why did we phone the MP? We were just in this moment in 2001 of gearing up to bid for the next round of Arts Council capital lottery funding to build that building. We were in very close relationships with the Borough Council, the County Council, the Regional Development Agency when they existed, and somebody else. And the MP, a Liberal Democrat called Bob Russell, look him up, he's quite a character, was an ex-media officer for the University of Essex, where I worked. And wrote a press release just about every day. He was very close to the garrison in Colchester, very strong supporter of, you know, the military community. And we knew that he was a very dangerous figure in this decision, quite capable of sending press releases to all and sundry and saying that we were showing this shocking film completely insensitively and so on. So the liberal compromise was also a mercenary one. In terms of morality, because we wanted to play that situation correctly in our own interest in terms of the longevity of contemporary visual arts in Colchester. The tour context is very interesting because we just thought, how could it be us? Why is it us? Why wasn't it DCA? You know, at that point, the director of the Arts Council England East in Cambridge was Andrew Stark, who had been the council officer in Dundee when DCA was initiated and built. And she never tired of telling us what an amazing place DCA was, how great it was. Okay? And then at the other end, we had Andrew Nairn bouncing around in Oxford, at the Museum of Oxford, you know, kind of contemporary arts where, you know, here in Oxford it's all happening. And we were there in Colchester, in this little bourgeois town, with a military garrison and a small-minded MP. and it was us, but not 2,000. So we did this, we announced in Rochester, and then I can't remember how many days after we made that announcement, we were able to announce that by popular demand we would start showing the film 3 days a week. Three times a day. So we did start showing it, and I can't remember how many days after that was. So that was the liberal compromise. The other thing I just wanted to add before, you know, open up to questions for Harry, who knows more about Grimonprez than I do, is just how amazing I thought this film was. You know, so and it chimes with what people have been saying about in a sense, the lesson of the film in the context, because I received the film in that context. Because I'm reading around about documentative and all that stuff, I have clocked this guy, by 2001, I know I'm supposed to know these things. And so I saw that film in that incredibly electric situation, and I just thought it was a fantastic piece of work. I found it amazingly ironic and playful and bitter in that context. Anyway, so that's what I
Right, so we've got a few minutes for any questions you might have for Harry and Neil. Obviously this has been a very contentious issue, but also perhaps you might have questions about Grimonprez's other work, or again, obviously Harry and Neil didn't get to join in the discussion, so I'm sure Harry might have some thoughts on his own take on the dilemma. So any questions from the floor? Yes, Andrew?
Thanks. Can I just start with lots to say? Just maybe one point to throw in. I saw it in Venice in 1997, and then it showed at CCA later in that year, 1997. Just to go back to that moment, it was definitely for me a nostalgic film, quite nostalgic, because it reminded me of being a very young person with Antilles Airport, remembering the 70s, early 70s hostage taking, but not having any sense of the politics of it. So it's kind of interesting that only 4 years later it sheds that entirely, so we have a different discussion of it now. But it really did feel quite nostalgic, 70s, along with Benny Hill and Walter Wise, and that's every effort. So that's one thing I think is very good. So the other thing which I think the end clip shows is the anti-American sort of commercialisation of the culture critique that is there, which sort of cuts right across all the other ideologies of the various hostage situations, which aren't necessarily only anti-American. So it's morally, it's a great film, it's a fantastic piece of work, but it's morally quite, troubling or fragmented. Just throw that out.
Yeah, any thoughts from you two on that?
It was interesting, there was an interview that Grimonprez did just after 2001, and he's asked, so, loads of people have seen your film as being some kind of, like Tamara said, hauntological of 9/11. And his response is really quite curious, because you would expect him to say, yeah, well, obviously I didn't know it was going to happen, things like this. And he says immediately, well, the thing about 9/11 is that America was asking for it, and he leaps straight into like this really, strong political position. And like you say, I mean, it's not necessarily ever stated it as such in the film, but that does run throughout the entire thing. The use of adverts, even the little bit at the end, we saw of Donald Duck waving a waving a McDonald's flag. There's bits like that drop in all over the place, and yeah. And in terms of the nostalgia as well, I think that's something that really runs through his films. Double Take is, I think, even more nostalgic in its in the imagery it uses, as well as the subject matter. Neil was saying beforehand, it's listed in the artist rooms, the sort of the official
on the webpage
presence of it. It now says Johan Grimonprez, Dial History in Flight, 97 to 2001. As in 2001, he produced a book that kind of developed some of the things that were raised in the film. But I'm trying to remember now, it does acknowledge 9/11, I think. So he himself kind of altered it in the wake of 9/11.
Any more questions on that?
I just want to say that a very strong narrative in this film, is that the contrast between the so-called terrorist figure and the author, obviously in the case of the video, who obviously extensively since Grimonprez was doing this, and this should be lost because both in relation to the two novels from where the quotes mostly come. I mean, you can read in Wikipedia about how they did it. Used to have this two like famous files, one terrorism, the other kind of like author. Because the reader felt that here, this is really what the film is asking, that the prerogative of action is actually moved from art, okay, be literature or whatever else, to the domain, of terrorism, okay? Be it state terrorism, media terrorism, or hijacking terrorism. And this is a very significant aspect of the film, so that's all.
Yeah, thanks for that, those thoughts. Any other thoughts from the room, or perhaps from you two?
It might interest you to know that I got switched on. Yes. That dial history was shown again in Colchester as part of the Artist Rooms tour in 2010. And part of the argument that allowed First Sight to secure the work again to show it just on its own was to say we have a special relationship to this film in Colchester. And they showed it in a shipping container outside the Sixth Form College as a sort of off-site work. And Grimonprez, going back to the artist being consulted, was furious about this, about the conditions in which the film was being shown. But it was a kind of, I think it was an opportunity because of Artist Rooms to reframe the work and to reflect on it again in the context of a cultural kind of interesting moment, I think.
Yeah.
And totally non-controversial.
Yeah, by that time. Yes, question down the front.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was any sort of public dissent or kind of combative attitude towards you actually including the film. Like, who was sort of on the front lines, like who kind of had to deal with that sort of argument?
Yeah, I was running the lines to make sure I did. There was a little bit, but I suppose the Liberal compromise did take the sting out of it, So, we had effectively the minute silence, and then the move on. And I think, that kind of managed that. It was, believe it or not, it was trying to build that building that really got the juices flowing in the local media. It wasn't that.
Right, well, maybe one more time for one more question? Right, okay. Well, thanks all for that. I hope you found it to be an engaging evening, and I hope you had a good discussion on your tables. So I'd just like to say thanks to our speakers, Neil and Harry, and also to Howard Rice hosting the event. Sorry.
That's our #1 fan.
And also for the interns for helping to organise this event. And as well as that, thanks to you all for coming and obviously participating, because without you and your discussion, this wouldn't really have worked.
Thank you for listening to Café des Artistes. For information on upcoming events, please visit the Artist Rooms Research Partnership website or like our Facebook page.